The Lord be with you.
And with your
A
spirit.
reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. On leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever. They immediately told Jesus about her. He approached, took her hand, and helped her up. Then the fever left her, and she waited on them. When it was evening, after sunset, they brought to Jesus all who were ill or possessed. The whole town was gathered at the door. He cured many who were sick with various diseases, not permitting them to speak because they knew him. Rising very early before dawn, he left and went off to a deserted place where he prayed. Simon and those who were with him pursued him, and on finding Jesus said, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus said, "Let us go to the nearby villages, that I may preach there also. For this purpose I have come." So he went into their synagogues, preaching and doing good works throughout Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus.
Lord Jesus Christ.
Running, cycling, or other long-distance endurance sports at first give a rush of enthusiasm and a burst of energy. However, at some point, there's a sudden moment of fatigue, a wave of heaviness that comes over the athlete, and this loss of energy is called hitting the wall. You might have heard the expression. Physically, this exhaustion is caused by the depletion of glycogen, so the physical energy goes. But after studying this phenomenon, it is now known that it's a psychological and in some ways a spiritual problem as well. There are many components to the condition, to the experience that the athlete has of this hitting the wall. Now, eating or drinking something, like something with carbohydrates, when it's possible can help, but of course, in a race, that's not something that is possible. In most cases, it requires the athlete to push through the wall by an act of will, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritually. Psychological tools and spiritual tools are called into play. The psychological component is to have the athlete picture the finish line, the goal, the end of the race, and in that vision comes a strength from within and a renewed enthusiasm. Spiritually, the opportunity is to look past the negative thoughts, past the feelings that this is the end of the line, and thereby the athlete has an opportunity to listen to that inner voice that says you can go on. It's a tapping in to a resource. And I don't know if any of you have had that type of experience running or cycling, or I'm sure in any sports, but we know basically the feeling. Sometimes you think you can't take another step, and yet we find within ourselves resources and strength and a determination that surprises us and at times delights us. Experienced athletes know that eventually they will hit the wall. It's an expectation that they need to push through to finish the race with a strength that does not seem to be their own. When everything in their mind and heart and body says stop, they are able to go on. So it's a physical, psychological, and spiritual challenge. The solution to it is also physical, psychological, and spiritual. So I'd like to make an analogy today that we as a world have, in the last 9, 12, 11 months, however long it's been, hit the wall. To put it simply, we know the experience of saying, enough, we've had it, we can't take another step. Now, the German language is known for its unique way of, first of all, stringing words together so they are exactly what they seem, But they also have an uncanny ability to give vivid images that help explain experiences that people have that would take many more words. For example, hitting the wall in German is called Der Mann mit dem Hammer. Hitting the wall in German is this. It's someone running up behind you with a hammer, catching up to you, and hitting you with it. You can imagine. Boom. That's the visual of the experience that an athlete has, and I dare say that we have, I'd like to say infrequently, but sometimes quite a few times a day. Now, it's a great image that really makes the point of what happens to us. We're running, we're going, we're doing, we're able, and then the wall, then the hammer. So what to do about that? Well, quite simply, if someone was chasing you with a hammer, you'd run a little faster, especially if they got you once. That is, in a sense, exactly what needs to happen when we think we can't go forward. We go forward. A lot easier to say than to do, but it is possible, and we know that we have done it before. So let's look at that. Breaking through the wall includes the tools of mind and heart and spirit. Now, this is nothing that we have invented. It's something that's part of our human nature. It's how we were created. It'd probably be more appropriate to talk about football than cycling or running, but I think that this analogy of hitting the wall is perfect for our scriptures today, and also it tunes in to our present experience of a long period of stress. So during these last months, we have been hitting the wall, but this is an old problem from the beginning of time. For example, Job, a very old book from the Hebrew Scriptures, is challenged, and he, in his own life, keeps hitting the wall, no matter what he does or what he says. He's a good man. It's just that difficult things keep happening to him. And this is how he describes it in today's Scriptures. I wonder if you were nodding your head as you heard it. He said his life had become misery, drudgery. He describes troubled, sleepless nights, restless, sleepless nights, where he just waits for the sun to come up. And he asks the question, will I ever see happiness again? How beautiful our Scriptures are when they echo, however negative it might be, our emotions. We know we're not alone. We're joined to a human family who has shared our experience. A family of faith, but a family of people as well. St. Paul, in his reading today, says that sometimes his mission causes him to have zeal, enthusiasm. He's glad to preach the gospel. It's a joy. And then at other times, he's just not willing. He wants to quit. Paul hits the wall. And in those moments, he's honest to speak about it to God. And he says, when I feel I cannot go on, I remember that I have a lot to be grateful for, and that my mission is to be a faithful steward, whether I feel like it or not. Paul pushes through the wall with an honesty in prayer that is a model for us. And now here's the surprise. In today's gospel, Jesus hits the wall. Sounds shocking, but it's true. We just heard the story. And it's not the only time we have a story like this. Jesus cures Peter's mother-in-law. He cures, the whole town is at the door. He's exhausted from preaching and working miracles. They won't leave him alone. Sound familiar? And he hits the wall. That night, he can't sleep. He shares that restlessness, a miserable night. So he gets up and he goes to a deserted place and he prays. And when he finishes praying, who's waiting for him? The disciples. You see, Jesus shared fully in our humanity and certainly fully in his divinity, but he understands our human experience because he experienced it himself. Jesus knows what it's like to hit the wall, and we can follow him as a model to push through it. Many times in the gospel, we see Jesus feeling that he's at the end of his rope and needing to use spiritual tools over and over again, particularly in Luke's gospel. He has a very active time in ministry, and he takes off in a boat to go to the other side, to go to the mountain. He spent 40 days in the desert. He needs to do what we're called to do, step aside and take that moment of prayer, of repose, to find the resources to push through the wall. Of course, the resources come from God. That's what Jesus discovered. That is true of us as well. This pattern, particularly in today's gospel, is exactly what we're called to do as well to get through the wall. So Jesus, first of all, changes his physical situation. He gets up and goes someplace else. That's our first move when we hit the wall, to do something physically different. It may mean that we need to eat something or drink something or exercise or take a walk or take a shower. The first move is to do something physical. What do they say? You want to change your mood? Move a muscle. That's the first step. The second one, of course, is psychological. Jesus makes the decision and acts upon it to go and pray, to make time to be with God. Maybe it was a difficult decision and he wishes he could have stayed asleep, but that's what he chose to do, and it made a difference. And we can be sure, as Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he hit that wall, that he was honest with his Father in heaven about his feelings, his expectations, his disappointments, his hopes, and he was suggesting to God the Father what the Father should do. Sound familiar? So that's an honest and true prayer. And finally, Jesus finds after that the ability to get up. The demands of life, the disciples coming, the people are waiting for you, helps him finally to break through the wall. He knows that his mission needs to continue, and he finds within himself what is necessary to move forward, and that is true of us too. Sometimes, and you sure have been thinking about it perhaps, I hope, as I spoke, the common human experience that we have of hitting the wall. When we think we cannot take another step, when we're disheartened by our relationships, when we're overwhelmed by our work, sometimes we're just fed up with ourselves. It's hitting the wall. It happens to all people. Our God understands and wishes to help us with that. The tools: physical change, psychological decision to pray, emotional honesty and truth in prayer, and finally, relying not on our strength as much as that reservoir of God's Spirit, which gives us the little extra intangible bit to push forward because we see the finish line. We know our mission. We recognize that each day we're called to continue to run the race, whether we feel like it or not, even though at times it seems like breaking through a wall. We remember the analogy, the German vision of this, of being chased by someone that has a hammer. At times we recognize that we can't go backward, we cannot stay where we are, and sometimes the spiritual grace and gift that God gives us is the only way to go when you're being chased is forward, even if it means pushing through a wall. Job, Paul, Jesus, saints throughout time, we're not doing anything wrong because this happens to us. It's our human condition, and yet we have spiritual tools that can help us to meet that challenge. The good news is that we have God to help us and that we can make good choices and decisions. So I invite you, as myself as well, as we go through this week, to recognize that we're running a race and that it has its great moments of challenge. There is enthusiasm at times, but there's also that wall that's inevitable that happens to us. 1 wall, 2 walls, 3 walls. Just when we're loving, sacrificing, doing, enjoying, boom, there's a wall to be pushed through, which is interesting because in our weakness, we find God's strength. We Learn by hitting the wall and going through it that God can do for us what we're incapable of doing for ourselves. So I invite you to look at your own life, to look over your shoulder and see who's chasing you with a hammer, and also to remember to use the tools. The physical changes, the psychological decision to pray, the emotional honesty, and finally the inner voice that gives us the courage to go forward. One day, this race will be over, and we will reach the ultimate finish line when we finally push through suffering and through the final wall of death into the bright light of God's glory. When we get to that finish line, we can say, as St. Paul did, I have won the race. And the good news is, when you win a race, you want someone cheering for you. And who's cheering? Can you hear their voices even now? You know who they'll be. Our relatives, our friends, the communion of saints, all who have gone before us are waiting at that finish line for us to push through that last wall. We'll have broken through, and we will be in that bright light of God's glory, and we'll be able to echo what St. Paul wrote in his second letter to Timothy, and we will be able to say this with faith, with confidence, with truth, and with love. I have competed well, I have kept the faith, I have won the race.